Let me go ahead and walk you through what the last 18 to 20 months of being a Brooklyn Nets fan like myself has looked like. I'm going to read this off my phone just so that I don't miss any of the details. About a year and a half ago, going into the 2021 playoffs, I was convinced that the Nets were the best team in the league. They beat Boston in the first round. They took Milwaukee all the way to Game 7, should have beaten Milwaukee despite the fact that both Kyrie and James Harden got hurt in that series. Then they go on to the following year. They have a disaster of a season. Harden requests a trade. They get swept by Boston after KD hurts his knee, something that sounds relatively familiar at the moment. Then this season, they start the year 1-5. Then they win against Indiana. They follow the win against Indiana by firing Steve Nash. They bring in Jacques Vaughn. Kyrie gets suspended. Then they look like an average team. Then they win 18 of their next 20 games, and then immediately Kevin Durant hurts his knee in basically the exact same way that he did the year before. And now, just like last year when KD got hurt, the team is a complete disaster. And I didn't even mention any of the offseason stuff between KD requesting a trade, Kyrie seemingly almost getting traded to the Lakers, then KD taking back his trade request. And by the way, like, I live in a realm of sports fandom where there are no expectations. Like, I'm a Nets fan and I'm a Carolina Panthers fan in the NFL. Those are the two professional teams that I care about. I'm not supposed to be invested in my teams. We're supposed to just be kind of okay. That 2021 playoffs where they beat Boston and lost to Milwaukee was the first time in my life that I've ever been fully invested in a Nets playoff run because they actually had a legitimate chance. And in my opinion at the time, if they were fully healthy, the best chance in the league to actually go on and win a title. I was a kid when the Nets were going to the finals in the early 2000s. It's the first time it's ever happened to me, and everything that has happened since then has basically been a complete disaster, with the exception of that little 18 of 20 stretch where they win like 11, 12, 13 games in a row. Everything's looking great. They do lose Chicago, but then they win another 4 games and they lose to Boston. Everything looks normal, and then KD gets hurt. And there's just, it's so weird how this has happened almost exactly the same as it has last year. A weird freak injury where someone falls on KD's knee. It's the exact same injury, although less severe this time, and immediately the team looks like it has completely forgotten how to play basketball without Kevin Durant. But even as bad as last year was, where they went on a double-digit losing streak and Harden was quitting on the team, and then he requests a trade, then they have the Harden trade, and then they get Simmons, but Simmons doesn't play. Even as bad as all that was, this might actually be worse, because the context of this team is now that every single night, every time you lose without Kevin Durant, it feels like you're pushing closer and closer and closer towards the end of the KD and Kyrie era in Brooklyn, because this is why he wanted to leave the team, among other reasons. Didn't like Steve Nash, didn't like the GM. How poorly they played last year when he was hurt is one of the main reasons that he cited in the offseason as to why he wanted to leave the team and why he requested a trade. And it's happening all over again. And I'd be lying if I said that as a fan I wasn't concerned, completely astronomically concerned about the fact that any day now, any week now, Kevin Durant could come out and say like, hey, I'm not going to risk my knee for the rest of this season for a team that's obviously not good if I'm not playing, and was just like, you know what, I'm just going to request a trade in the offseason. Or he comes back and the season ends exactly the way it did last year, where they lose in the first round. Then you go into the offseason and he looks at the team again and realizes they're nothing without me. There's other opportunities that I could go to. I'd be lying if I said that that wasn't a massive concern for me right now. And that has been the theme of the entirety of this Nets era, is they can look like absolute world beaters. They can, as they looked in the beginning of the 2021 playoffs, like the best team in the league, and one thing goes wrong or two things goes wrong and everything completely falls apart. Now, I will say that just in terms of a basketball team, they are better constructed this year. Claxton is better. He's been incredible this year. They have better wings. They have better size. They have better shooting. Simmons does help them in a couple of different ways that they did need. And so that is at least helpful, but it's mind-boggling and it's so confusing, especially, like I said, for a fan like myself, that I'm not used to expectations. I'm used to my teams being boring. I'm not used to having a ton of drama. I'm used to my football team winning 7 or 8 games, and I'm used to a good season for the Nets being like a 45-win season. This is not something that I'm accustomed to, and honestly, it's driving me nuts being a fan of this team for the last 18 to 20 months. Now, I say all that, and of course, the theme of all of this is that it's very dramatic. You go from one end of the spectrum to the other. Things could easily be just fine in 2 weeks. Kevin Durant gets reevaluated for his knee injury soon. He could come back in a week or two. He could have missed a total of like 7 or 8 games, and they go 500 that stretch if they win the next couple of games, and everything's fine. But the thing that concerns me, especially about this team, other than the possibility of Kevin Durant or Kyrie or just everything completely falling apart at any moment, is seeding matters a ton in the Eastern Conference this year. There are 5, if you're including Brooklyn in this, 5 really, really good teams in the conference. And 2 of those teams are going to face each other in the first round. Like, these 5 teams, you've got Brooklyn, Boston, Milwaukee, Philly, and Cleveland. Those are the 5 best teams in the East. It's not particularly close, and they're all very good. I think every single one of them has a legitimate chance to represent the Eastern Conference in the finals, depending on what they do at the trade deadline. deadline, one of those teams is not making the second round, and two of them are facing each other in the second round and going into a huge disadvantage series in the second round after beating up on each other in the first and then going to play the 1 seed. Like, that is a massive deal. Nobody wants to be the 4 and nobody wants to be the 5. If you play, the 6 seed or one of the play-in teams because you're the 1, 2, or the 3 seed, then you should be fine. But you can't afford to go on losing streaks like this, and the Nets specifically cannot afford to be without Kevin Durant and play this poorly without him for this long of a stretch. And to me, like, the MVP conversation has been a big deal this year. There's been a lot of conversation about if Jokic could potentially win a third MVP, and really where I've landed with the way that numbers are now and how incredible the performances are on a nightly basis, there's like 5 guys this year that are having MVP worthy seasons in different seasons relative to what was happening that particular year. Everybody's just playing out of their minds. But if you want to look specifically at like what the team looks like when the guy plays versus what the team looks like when he doesn't play, I don't see how Kevin Durant is not at least tied for first in the MVP conversation, assuming that he's healthy and plays the rest of the year and plays like 65 to 70 games, because they were in that winning 18 of 20 games in that stretch where they were playing incredibly. They were a top 10 team defensively, but it's really difficult to do with this roster construction with really only Claxton, Simmons, sometimes, and KD being positive defenders. Everybody else really doesn't defend that well. That's pretty incredible. A lot of that had to do with KD, and then they were one of the best offensive teams in the league as well. And since he got hurt, they've been awful on defense. They can't score the ball either. And again, the one thing that changed, the one big difference is the fact that KD hasn't been playing. And to me, what this is leading to is what could potentially be a pretty active trade deadline for Brooklyn. Because if you look at this situation, you're the Nets, and you go through everything you went through in the offseason and you manage to reel it all back in, so much so to the point that not only does Kevin Durant request a trade, takes it back, Kyrie almost got traded, he ends up coming back and opting in, you fire your coach, then you bring in an interim coach that is unproven as a head coach at the NBA level, then you go on this crazy winning streak and you're at one point tied with Boston for the best record in the East and in the league. You go through all that, you kind of have to treat this season as this could be our last chance. Like, this could be our last real opportunity to win a title, potentially, at least contend for one. I mean, KD's getting older. Obviously, the injury stuff has been what it is. That stuff can change completely 180 at any moment. That's been proven throughout the last couple of years in Brooklyn. And at the trade deadline, you have to, in my opinion, make some kind of move, because it doesn't make any sense to save your 2025 or whatever first round pick, or to save some of these younger assets for 3 years from now, because these guys are not going to be around, and you're not going to be as good of a contender, even if they are still around at that point in time. Like, Simmons is technically a younger player, but I don't think he's getting any better than this. He's going to get healthier, but what you're expecting out of Simmons is not going to increase, I don't think, over the next couple of seasons. And of course, KD and Kyrie are getting older. So trading away like Cam Thomas, Seth Curry, and a first for a wing that can guard and can shoot, or a big that can play in the front court and rebound and play alongside Simmons, like, I think those things are really critical to this roster. If they were willing to give him a big contract in the offseason to re-sign him, I think Kyle Kuzma would be a really good fit for Brooklyn. He can score, he can guard, he can shoot, and importantly, in these stretches where KD's not playing, or Simmons doesn't have it offensively, or Kyrie doesn't have it offensively, he can provide you some individual creation, which I think this team is desperately lacking. And he's big enough to, I think, play in the front court alongside Simmons. And obviously, he's not going to be able to guard fives, but that at least gives you a little bit more size, rather than like Royce O'Neal playing the 4 basically alongside Simmons when Simmons does play the 5. If it's not that, then you're looking at like Kelly Olynyk or something, like some kind of front court player that is a spacer and can guard is what they need, that can play alongside Simmons. And it's just really difficult to find that. I mean, like, maybe Miles Turner would have been a possibility 6 months ago, but it seems like Indiana wants to keep him. And I don't know how his fit is alongside Claxton, because Claxton's been really good. Like, he is almost an all-star caliber player. He's one of the best defensive players in the league right now. And so he has to play, without foul trouble, 25 to 35 minutes a game. Simmons is going to play some minutes at the backup 5. And so getting, making year one move, trading away a first or whatever to get a big, doesn't really help you a ton if it's only taking up like 10 to 15 minutes a game. That feels more like a guy maybe you can get as a buyout player, or a smaller deal to add, because they do need a bigger body to guard guys like Embiid and Giannis in the postseason at the 5 spot. But to me, this has to be an aggressive deadline. Like, this can't be a situation where we get to the middle of February and they didn't make a move at the deadline and they're the 5th seed in the conference and everybody's back, but they're not playing particularly well, and everybody else in the conference is upgraded. Like, this to me is a wide open league this year. Like, teams like Memphis and Denver in the West West are playing really well, but the rest of that conference I think is certainly up in the air. And obviously Boston is incredibly good. We saw how many issues they gave Brooklyn last year, and the rest of the East, as I mentioned, is very good as well. But I don't see, other than maybe Boston, a team that is like a completely different level than anyone else, nor a completely different level than what we saw Brooklyn at during that streak where they won 18 of their 20 games. And it all just comes down to, you know, health obviously for them and what they do at the deadline. And really I wanted to take this video partially to talk about what's happening with them, trade possibilities, but also just for people that haven't experienced it directly the way that I have, to really fully understand the timeline of this and how insane it has been. I mean, I would argue that it has been like a top 5 craziest run for like a fan of a team in terms of just everything that's happened over the last couple of seasons and the different ends of the spectrum you end up on in terms of optimism for your team and thinking that everything's going to fall apart at any second. But yeah, we're looking forward to the rest of the season. It's going to be fun. It's probably not going to be fun. I'm going to be a mess the entire time. I'm hoping they turn it around. I'm hoping they get someone to the deadline. Hopefully KD's healthy and they can be a really good playoff team, because I think in terms of teams that have given them issues in the past, they've looked really good this year. And I do think that the roster is better this year than it was last year. And if KD's healthy, I think they have a shot in any of these series. And maybe it'll turn out like 2021, someone to get hurt and everything falls apart. But there's something here for Brooklyn, and I'm hoping that this little downturn doesn't snowball the way that it did at the end of last season and then going into that offseason. But as we've learned with this team, anything's possible. Anything can happen. So we'll see.